The dry wind of the Arizona plains carried dust and danger as Daniel Crowley rode into the small frontier settlement. The sun burned low on the horizon, turning the wooden storefronts into long silhouettes. Daniel had no plans to stay. He was just passing through after selling cattle to a ranch 2 towns over. But then his eyes caught movement near the old trading post. A group of Apache women, unarmed and frightened, surrounded by 4 drunken bounty hunters. Their voices were loud, filled with mockery, and their rifles glinted like warning fangs in the evening light. Daniel slowed his horse, instincts sharpening. The women were huddled together, clutching each other, eyes darting between the men and the open road as if calculating escape. But there was no way past. The hunters had boxed them in. One man staggered forward, his laughter cruel, waving a rope like it was a game. "Got ourselves some runaways," he jeered. The others laughed, but Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this kind of cruelty before on the borderlands. It always started with jokes. It never ended that way. He swung down from his horse, boots sinking into the dusty ground with a slow, deliberate crunch. The sound caught the men's attention, and the air grew heavier. Daniel stepped forward, his tall frame casting a shadow. "Between the bounty hunters and the women, that's far enough," he said, voice low but carrying the weight of a man who'd been obeyed before. His hand rested loosely near the grip of his revolver, not threatening yet ready. The tallest hunter smirked, squinting at him. "You planning to make this your business, stranger?" Daniel's gaze didn't shift. Already as for a moment, the only sounds were the groaning wind and the creak of leather from the hunters' belts. One of the men stepped aside, revealing something Daniel hadn't seen at first. A boy, maybe 12 years old, clinging to one of the women's skirts, his face pale with fear. The sight hardened Daniel's resolve. The hunters weren't just looking for trouble, they were predators circling prey. And predators didn't back down without force. The one with the bow stepped forward, his teeth clenched around a wad of tobacco. He wasn't smiling. Without warning, he raised the weapon and drew the string back, the arrow's tip aimed square at the cluster of terrified women. Time seemed to slow. Daniel didn't think. There wasn't time to heat. Lunged sideways, putting himself in the path of the arrow just as the bowstring sang. A sharp, burning pain tore through his shoulder, but his feet stayed planted. He was the wall they couldn't break. The women gasped, one reaching out toward him, but Daniel's hand shot up in warning. "Stay back," he growled, blood warmed his sleeve, but his eyes stayed locked on the archer. "You're going to regret that." In one motion, his revolver cleared leather, the hammer cocking with a click that cut through the wind. The 3 other hunters froze. They hadn't expected anyone to stand in front of Apache women, especially not a white rancher. Daniel's stare burned into them, unflinching despite the wound. The archer's smirk faltered. "You'd risk your life for them," he spat. Daniel's voice was iron. "Already have." He shifted his stance, making it clear he could fire before any of them could reload or draw. The moment hung in the air, the wind tugging at his coat, the pain in his shoulder threatening to pull him down. But he held firm, knowing that if he wavered even for a second, the women behind him would be lost. Out here, mercy was a rare currency and Daniel intended to spend every last bit of his on them. The twang of the bowstring cut the air like a whip, echoing through the rocky valley. Daniel's instincts screamed at him, but there was no time to think, only to move. He lunged forward, spreading his arms wide, placing his body between the rain of arrows and the frightened women behind him. The first arrow hit hard, slamming into his shoulder with a burning shock. Pain tore through him, but his feet held firm. A second arrow struck his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs. Yet he didn't fall. The Apache women gasped, frozen in a moment that seemed endless. Another arrow hissed through the air, finding his leg. The force drove him to one knee, the dry dust swirling around him. He gritted his teeth, blood trickling down his arm, his vision swimming. Yet his eyes stayed fixed on the attackers' dark figures at the edge of the canyon, their bows trembling. In their hands, Daniel's glare was not of a desperate man, but of one who had chosen his ground. His silence spoke louder than any threat, and the enemy faltered. Unsure, one by one, the men began to back away. They spat curses, muttered in their tongue, and vanished into the brush, unwilling to face a man who would stand and bleed without a trace of fear. The echoes of their retreat faded into the wind, leaving only the ragged sound of Daniel's breathing. The Apache women rushed to him, their steps light but urgent. Their hands trembled as they touched his wounds, pressing strips of cloth to stem the bleeding. He swayed under their care, his body screaming for rest. They worked quickly, whispering to one another in low voices as they half-carried, half-dragged him toward a hidden path. Daniel tried to protest, but his words dissolved into a cough. His strength spent. The path wound through a narrow gorge, hidden from sight, and ended at a small lodge made of hide and timber. Inside, the smell of herbs filled the air, and a dim fire glowed in the center. He collapsed onto a bed of woven blankets. Darkness, pulling at the edges of his vision, days blurred into one another. Fever came and went like tides, and in those hazy hours, Daniel saw faces, some from the past, some from the present. The Apache women tended to him without rest, applying poultices, cleaning his wounds, and speaking to him in soft tones, even when he couldn't respond. He caught fragments of their language, words heavy with gratitude and quiet respect. The lodge became his entire world, the flicker of the fire his constant companion. When he finally woke fully, the world outside was quiet. Light spilled in through the hide flap, and the sound of a river reached his ears. His shoulder ached sharply, his leg was bound, and every breath reminded him of the arrow that had struck his ribs. But the bleeding had stopped, and his strength, though slow, was returning. One of the women noticed his stirring and knelt beside him, her expression warm. She offered him water, and he drank deeply, the coolness washing away the dryness in his throat. In time, they told him what had happened. After he collapsed, they had feared the attackers might return, but none had dared. Word had spread quickly that the women were under the protection of a man who fought like no other, a man who bled for them without asking for anything in return. Among their people, such an act meant more than courage, it meant honor. Daniel listened quietly, unsure how to respond. He had not done it for recognition, only because it was right. Still, their gratitude was something he could feel in the way they spoke his name. The days grew warmer, and Daniel's body began to heal. He could sit up without pain, walk with a cane, and even help with small tasks around the lodge. The women allowed him to see more of their village, a cluster of lodges surrounded by fields of corn and beans. Children played in the dirt paths, pausing to stare at him with wide eyes before darting away. The elders would nod respectfully when he passed, their lined faces revealing nothing but silent acknowledgement. For a man used to living on the edges of society, the quiet acceptance was more than he had expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, one of the women, tall, with long braids streaked with silver, brought him to the riverbank. She knelt beside him and placed a hand over his bandaged shoulder. In halting English, she told him that his actions had not only saved their lives but had restored their faith that bravery still walked the earth. She said that scars were not marks of pain, but of stories worth telling. Daniel looked down at the water, seeing his reflection distorted by the ripples, and realized she was right. When he finally prepared to leave, the women gathered outside the lodge. They presented him with a leather pouch, stitched carefully and filled with dried herbs for his wounds. Around his neck, they placed a small pendant carved from bone. They explained that he would always be welcome among them. Daniel accepted the gifts with quiet respect, understanding that their meaning ran deeper than the objects themselves. His journey would continue, but a part of him would remain in this valley, tied to the people he had nearly died to protect. As he walked away from the village, the scars on his body felt less like burdens and more like reminders. Each one marked a choice, a moment where he had stood his ground, even when it meant bleeding for strangers. He knew that somewhere, the attackers might still speak of the man who faced them without fear. And somewhere else, the women he had saved might tell their children of the day a lone wanderer stood between them and death. Not for reward, but because it was the only thing his heart could allow. By the time the valley faded from sight, Daniel's limp had grown less noticeable. The cane tapped softly against the dirt road, keeping time with his steady pace. Ahead lay uncertainty, perhaps danger, and almost certainly hardship. But behind him, he left something far greater, a legacy of courage witnessed by those who would never forget. And in his heart, every scar was worth it.